Hello, my name is Rich Howard, owner of Architectural Builder Supply. This video is to bring you a closer look at the Hager number 1251. This is a spring hinge from Hager. It's a spring hinge, which means it's very common, very typical and common. But this hinge is specifically going to mean that it is a radiused corner hinge. So a 1250 is going to be the standard Hager spring hinge, a 1250. That's if you're going to do a spring hinge from Hager and it's commercial, it's probably going to be a 1250. Very typical, very common. The 1251 is that same hinge. It's just going to have a 1/4 inch radiused corner. Okay. Doesn't appear to be incredibly, well, maybe they are. I was going to say they don't appear to be consistent preparations to make them radius corner, but perhaps they are. They look a little staggered. It appears to be an after process that they're doing, a post process, although the steel is certainly finished. So this is a 1250. That means it's a 1/4 inch radius. It's a single acting spring hinge. It is the standard self-closing spring hinge. It's not a reverse action. This, if it appears to be slightly unusual in its size, it might be because it's 4.5 tall and 4 inch wide. Okay, that's a really good size though, and we'll explain why 4 inch wide is a good size versus the far more common 4.5, 4.5. It will have a label, basically a stamp or a die stamp on the hinge leaf. That's required. If you're using spring hinges on a fire-rated door, the hinge must be labeled. It must actually bear evidence of the compliance with its listing, meaning it's been tested on a fire-rated door. If you are doing a spring hinge on a fire-rated door and there's no evidence of any sort of UL mark, it would be expressly prohibited by NFPA 80 for use on a fire door. Speaking of that as well, you can only do doors up to 7 foot tall with a 3070, in fact, with spring hinges, and you have to have a minimum of 2. Just to go over the requirements of that a little bit further. Now let's take a look at, let's dissect that part number. 1251 means it's a single acting spring hinge with a 1/4 inch radius. This is also a hinge that is standard weight. We'll get to that in a moment. This does happen to be 4.5 by 4, and let's dive into that right now. It's 4.5 inches tall. The height is the first dimension on a hinge. The width is the second dimension. It's important to know that, so that if you're ordering a hinge that's not square, like 4.5 by 4, you know how tall you're going to be prepping your door and frame. What we mean to say is it's not 4 inch tall and 4.5 wide. The height is the first dimension. That's important, again, if the door is something other than square. Okay, like you might see in a wide throw application. Maybe you have a 4.5 by 7. It's important to know the width is the height is the first dimension. Okay. This is in the satin chrome finish. It would be more appropriate to call this, they're calling it US 26D, which we know to be satin chrome. It would be better to call it 652, which is going to tell us that it's made of a steel-based material. Okay? A steel-based material. That would also be important to know for a couple of reasons. Obviously, hinges on a fire door need to be of a ferrous-based material, or they can be stainless steel. They just can't be non-ferrous, like brass or bronze. Don't really think you're going to find brass or bronze on a spring hinge, but you'll definitely find stainless and then steel base. It's important to know that as well if you're dealing with any hinge on a fire door. It has to be made of steel or stainless steel. It's also important to know it's steel, satin chrome plated over steel, because it will ultimately affect the finish that you're looking at. A 652 is the BHMA code for satin chrome over a steel base, whereas most of us might think of 626. Well, that's satin chrome as well, but that's over a brass, or that's over a brass-based material. Okay. Now, and we're talking about the different finishes that is available on this. Certainly satin chrome. This will be available in all of the common finishes that can be done on steel. Your brass, your bronze, your chrome, nickels, satin, polished, things of that nature. Oil rub bronze as well. Okay, anything that can be done on steel. Okay. Now let's take a look. Let's take a closer look at the. We've dissected the part number. We've talked about the size. Now, why is the size 4.5 by 4? Why is that a good idea? Or why is this person asking for a 4.5 by 4? The reason I say that is because if you're dealing with standard hinges, they're generally square. 4 by 4, 4.5, 4.5, but that's 4.5 by 4. Let's dissect that a little bit. Let's switch to the camera view for a closer look. Okay, so a closer look is going to be as follows. Why would someone want a hinge that's not as wide as it is tall? Okay, so first of all, you have your door. Okay, door is going to swing out. Your hinge is going to be here, roughly. Door is going to swing out. The vertical axis of pivoting is here. You're going to have 2 inches from the center line of this to the edge of the leaf. Okay. Now, in a 4.5 by 4, but the more common hinge is a 4.5 by 4.5, whereas that center line of the vertical axis of pivoting to the leaf would be 2.25 inch. The point of the matter is this. It is considered best practice when you have a condition where there is no obstacle in this area that you bring the vertical axis of pivoting as close to the face of the door as practical. If you had 2 choices in this application, 4.5 by 4.5 or 4.5 by 4, the textbook correct answer would be 4.5 by 4. You would want to consider a 4.5 by 4.5 if you had the need to drive that vertical axis of pivoting further out. Or you might consider it if you had no option, if the hinge you needed wasn't available in a 4.5 by 4. But in instances where you have a condition like this versus a condition where you are, in this application, let's assume that you're wrapping the wall with your frame. Okay, a couple of studs, you're wrapping the wall. That door is going to be able to get turned all the way around from here all the way out to here. You're not going to have any conflict at all. Okay? But if we had an application where we were doing a frame that was butted to the edge of a wall, now we really got to start to think, where's that vertical axis of pivoting falling in place in relationship to my door, and what's it going to look like when it swings 180 degrees around? Okay, so now that dimension becomes important. But a 4.5 by 4 is really going to be the common application when you are wrapping the frame over the wall, or, and not that this is not where this hinge is going to be used, but in an aluminum storefront. Aluminum storefront very commonly use 4-inch wide hinges, okay, rather than 4.5, because there's no need for the wide hinge. Okay, those doors are limited to about 110 degree generally by their door closer or the application. The concept of having a hinge narrower than it is wide is because when you have a frame, okay, what you really want to work towards is eliminate, as best as you can, the projecting hardware off the face of the door. Okay? Don't let that hardware hang off any further off the face of the door or the frame than necessary as you're traveling down a corridor and you've got, let's say, 10 doors on this side and 10 doors on the other side, you really want to keep the encroachment of projecting hardware to a minimum. It's also true that a hinge where you draw your vertical axis of pivoting as close to the face of the door as possible is a hinge that will operate more mechanically sound, because you're asking the hinge to do technically less work. And that's even more important when you're dealing with a spring hinge. That is two things. It's not a load-bearing hinge, and it's also trying to act as a door closer. So doing this as much as possible is always the wisest thing possible. So when you do not have any sort of wall clearance or trim clearance that you need to move this vertical axis of pivoting this way, go with the narrower hinge. Okay, that's always a better idea. Now, let's switch back over to the view of the item that we're looking at and take a look at the template and other important documents. Now, the extended description of the item that we're looking at is here and does go over the fact that it's UL listed, full mortise. It's a full mortise hinge, meaning that when the leaves are brought parallel together, they're meant to be mortised flush to the edge of the door and frame. The gauge of the hinge is 134 thousandths. That means that it is a commercial grade hinge. It's also called standard weight. Again, 1/4 inch radius on the corners. It's for an 1 3/4 thick door, but you could make a 4-inch wide hinge certainly work on a door that's thicker. And I suppose if you were determined one that's even thinner, but a 4-inch wide is really 1 3/4 is what that is. 4 inch, 4.5. Those two are good for 1 3/4. If you need to go to 1 3/8, you're looking at a 3.5 inch wide hinge. And if you get out to 2 inch and bigger, you need to start thinking of a wider hinge. But then there really aren't spring hinges for that sort of application. We're going to get into the installation instructions and talk about the application, how many hinges you would use. We already talked about what you need for a fire-rated door. So you would never use one spring hinge. You'll need at least two. Okay, hinges. These hinges are going to include screws. We'll go over that at the end of the video. For automatic closing of doors and meets codes for these applications, hotels, motels, institutions, commercial buildings. For maximum versatility, use all spring hinges or a combination of spring and ball bearing. Never use plain bearing hinges. Never. It's not the way that spring hinges are meant to be combined with. If you're going to mix and match, always use your ball bearing hinges at the top of the door, and then use your spring hinges in the middle and bottom. What you do have to be absolutely sure of is that your width of your hinges is the same, and that your gauge is incredibly close. Okay, it doesn't have to be identical, but it needs to be within about 0.010 of an inch. You can't have a residential quality, or a heavyweight hinge, I should say, more of appropriate. You can't have a hinge that's 180 thousandths thick acting as your ball bearing at the top. It needs to be the same gauge as well. Full spring tension may not be required on all hinges. We'll talk about the setting of the spring tension. Strong wind conditions, drafts, carpeting drag, twisted, malaligned frames. And the reason that's important is that this is important is that a twisted frame or a door that's not plumb, true, level, and square, the spring hinge is going to have a real tough time getting the door to operate correctly. So be mindful of making sure that your door is installed healthily first. You can't, a spring hinge is really not the best way to close a door, but sometimes it could be the only reasonable way. So having a door installed correctly is important. Weather stripping on doors may require additional spring hinges. Okay. Now, let's get into the template, installation instructions, and product catalog moving forward. Okay, now taking a look at the template, installation instructions, and product catalog. Let's start with the template. The template's important because it will show you where the location for all of the screw holes will occur. If you're not sure if your hinge matches, or if you're not sure if this hinge is going to match your existing hinge your screw hole locations, and by all means check this. If you have a 4.5-inch hinge and that hinge is, 5 decades, is not older than 5 decades, it's very likely going to be this hinge pattern. It's worth a look, I suppose, but I wouldn't worry about it not matching, because in a 4.5-inch size, if you have a commercial gauge hinge, a hinge that is 134 thousandths of an inch thick, it's very likely going to be called, or it's very likely going to be this template pattern, which is what we call the template pattern. The exact location of these holes, these exact dimensions, are referred to as the template pattern. So, like I said, reviewing it to make sure it's going to work is fine, but it's most likely going to be exactly what you need. Now, they give an illustration here showing that it is indeed a full mortise hinge. As I said earlier, when those leaves are brought flush to each other, they're meant to be mortised to the door and frame, providing you that gap between the two leaves. Okay, there is this feature here that's called the swag. The swag of the hinge. That bend right there is what makes it a full mortise hinge. As you change the swag, you change the type of hinge that it is. Most notably, of course, full mortise to full surface. If there was no swag at all, they would be full surface hinges. This template is going to be appropriate for the 1250, the 1251, and the 1252. The only difference there being is the treatment on the corner. Square corner, 1/4 inch or 5/8 radius. How these radiuses are achieved is when you're mortising the wood door and wood frame for your hinge, you're using either a 1/2 inch diameter bit or an 1.25 inch diameter bit. And pre-hangers will very commonly use radiused corner hinges, or people who manufacture doors and frames will very often use radius corner because it's less work. You don't have to go back and square the corner out. If you are using, let's say, an 1.25 inch diameter router bit to prep your doors, that will leave that 5/8 radius. If you don't go back and square that out, you're saving yourself quite a bit of time when you're trying to manufacture, let's say, 3,000 door units a day. Same logic with the 1/4 inch radius. The tool path on an 1.25 inch diameter router bit is less work. There's less distance to cover when you're removing more material per pass than this. So 5/8 radius is very common. In hollow metal door work, you're going to have, of course, the square corner. If you wanted that same hinge in a non-ferrous base material, which would be stainless, in polished or satin, it would be the 1150. They don't do that in these radiused corner. Not that you couldn't put your hinge onto a bench grinder. Don't know that I'd want to really try that on something that was polished, throwing that much heat onto it. But you could probably do a reasonable job getting a 1/4 inch radius, and that is in fact what looks like the factory does. Then they have their F dimension here, the length of the leaf itself, for the 4.5 by 4 and the 4.5 by 4.5. So you can study that information. Now let's move to the installation instructions. Let's get to the product catalog first. The product catalog will allow you to go over all of these single-acting full mortise spring hinges in one document. Okay, you can see how the part number changes. Oh, it's interesting. They do offer the non-ferrous base material in 1/4 inch radius and 5/8 radius. It's not listed on their template. There are we do notice occasionally that there are some information. There are pieces of information sometimes that haven't been added to Hager templates. It's the constant catch-up business with proper information on templating when you're a company that's been in business for over 150 years. The library of what they need to keep up to date is probably very staggering. So we've basically covered the top 6 hinges. You get to the 1255 or the 1256, it's just you're getting a set of them as listed. If you were to order a set, the 1256 would certainly be the more common with the BB 1279 hinge rather than the AB 700, which I believe is a 3-knuckle hinge. This is a 5-knuckle hinge. Okay. Although, if you wanted to match the look of your spring hinge, go with the AB 700 because it will be a 3-knuckle hinge. Okay, let's continue on with the product brochure. Okay, so going through the product catalog a little bit more, you'll see some other spring hinges that are worth noting. A reverse action style, should you want the door to automatically, or the door to open when you release the latch. These reverse action spring hinges would do that job. A reverse action spring hinge would be used when you want, let's say, an office door normally held open. It's always to be held open, only closed at such a time when privacy is required. So reverse action, not a very common hinge, but certainly common enough where you will encounter them occasionally. There's also a swing clear spring hinge, which is nice. A swing clear hinge is going to permit you to remove, for all intents purposes, the entire door from the opening of the frame. A swing clear hinge would work in such a way where if you had a regular hinge, okay, here's your door. When this door opens, the door is basically going to be, that's still there, the door is basically going to be consuming part of your clear opening space. So that door goes from 90 degree, from closed, and will open to 90 degree. The clear opening space is what's being encroached upon by this part of the unit, and that's because the location of the vertical axis of pivoting. Well, a swing clear hinge is going to take that vertical axis of pivoting and move it over here because the hinge is shaped like a funny L. Okay? You certainly get the concept. Then your door is here. Well, the point is when that door opens to 90 degree, the leaf will look like this. Your door is going to look like this. Okay? Removing the door, for all intents and purposes, completely out of the clear opening. Of course, this drawing is not to scale, but when we move the vertical axis of pivoting from here to here, that's how you're able to move that door from where it would normally reside here to here. So that's your swing clear. You'll use swing clear hinges when you have to maintain, of course, a clear opening for meeting requirements of the ADA guide, A117, usable building practices and standards. And that's the product brochure. Then the installation instructions we had left till the end. Now, the installation instructions, we'll go over them on paper, then I'll demonstrate it on the hinge itself. First of all, your sizing, okay? The weight of the door and how many hinges they're talking about, okay? So this chart is assuming that you do not have fire-rated doors, because if you did, this would always be 2. There should be a note here somewhere. I don't see a note anywhere at all. I would update these installation instructions with a note providing the excerpt out of NFPA 80. NFPA 80 is let's take a look here, see if we can quickly find that chart, which we will. Here it is. Here's that chart. NFPA 80, this is the 2013 edition. (80-19) is the heading on the page. Spring hinges shall be labeled and shall meet the requirements of ANSI A156.17. And as you read through the requirements for spring hinges, and in particular this table, we'll see a note here under hinges and pivots, 6.4.3.1.1.2, where spring hinges are used, at least 2 shall be provided. And the word shall is a mandatory term, meaning there are 2 words that are used, shall and should. Should is optional, shall is mandatory. So you must have at least 2. According to the table, which does take a little bit of studying, but according to the table, if we're dealing with builder's hardware, hinges, spring hinges, and pivots. So we're really just focusing on the spring type, here and here. So we're dealing with the spring type, 4.5, maximum door size, 7 foot. Okay. You're dealing with doors taller than that, 8 foot, 10 foot. Spring is not included in here at all for those taller door heights. Okay, so that's where that's coming right out of the NFPA 80 standard. If the NFPA 80 standard has been adopted in your local building code, it becomes part of the code and is therefore, this information is therefore code. So that's where that's coming from. My point is I would like to see that on this document, saying, hey, by the way, you're doing a spring hinge, it's 4.5 tall, commercial grade and template pattern. I have a sinking feeling you're installing it on a fire-rated door. And if so, don't go taller than 7 foot and use at least 2 spring hinges. So I don't see that here anywhere, but nonetheless, that's the facts. That's the fact of the matter. If your local building code hasn't adopted any part of NFPA 80's section on spring hinges, well then, there you go. Would not be as mandatory. So here's your chart, as we had talked about earlier, and we also said, if you're using 2, center and bottom, put your ball bearing hinge up at the top of the door. And I would really think that 115-pound doors where you're going to mostly reside. I am a fan of using all spring hinges when you have a condition that you really require more stored energy in spread amongst all of the spring hinges. When you have a air pressure condition, you have a condition where perhaps the door and frame are not installed exactly true plumb level and square, so you might use that. However, again, spring hinges aren't load-bearing hinges, so in most instances for 3070 commercial doors, this is right where you're going to be. 115, 2 spring hinges, and then 1 ball bearing hinge at the top, and that's why they offer those sets, 2 spring and 1 standard hinge. So install bearing hinge at the top with spring hinges top and center. They're saying there should be a 1/4 inch clearance at the bottom of the door for vacuum relief. That means that there should be a minimum of a 1/4 inch undercut to provide, when you push the door open, a way in which the air can transfer from one side of the opening to the next. If you have a large stacked amount of air pressure on that closing side of the door, the hinges are going to have a more difficult time closing the door because there's no movement of air. So step 2, open the door by hand to 90 degree and push it closed. If the door latches, the hinges are ready to receive tension. So once you've hung the door on all of your hinges, make sure the door works mechanically. Make sure it physically works. Make sure the door latches, because if it doesn't latch without spring tension, it's not going to latch with spring tension. If there is resistance or the door doesn't work correctly, you'll have to mitigate that problem. Corrected before tension can be applied. And the door weight should not exceed the recommended requirements. This includes all hardware and veneer. Be mindful that if you have a door that's 115 pounds, well, you've got 4 pounds of lock set. You've got 12 pounds of door closer. So be mindful. The hardware can certainly add up and will obviously affect the total weight of the door. Okay, so continuing through with our installation instructions. The spring hinge adjustment we're going to go over on the hinge itself as well, but it's basically you're going to install the hinges as you normally would, with the tension collar pointed towards the top of the door. It'll work for a right-hand door or a left-hand door. As long as the tension collar is pointed towards the top of the door, you'll rotate the included Allen wrench clockwise, and as you do so, you'll reveal new additional holes in your hinge into which you'll insert what they call a locking pin. Insert the tension wrench, turn clockwise, insert the locking pin. That's just how you set tension. Release hex wrench until locking pin contacts the side of the adjusting hole. Remove hex wrench and check the door for closing force. If you need to make any changes, do so. Use safety when installing these hinges. Door should be in the closed position when you're setting the tension. Don't hold it open because it will immediately want to start to close as you increase the tension on the tension collar, which is winding the spring. Don't go past 3 holes if you're going to 180 degree, and up to 4 holes if you're going to 90 degree. If you hear any creaking in the spring and you're beyond that, you'll want to back that off. You don't want to break a spring inside of here. Okay. Do not force, sure, of course. So let's pause this video and take a look at the setting of tension on the spring on camera. So for every order that you place, you'll get at least 1 tension wrench, 1 Allen wrench, and for every hinge that you order, you'll get 1 locking pin. Okay, so the tension collar is here. Okay, Allen wrench is going to fit inside of there. The bottom doesn't have one, so install it with the tension collar pointed towards the top of the door, and that's the hole where you're going to see the area into which you can install. That wrench fits right inside of there. That area is going to show you those new holes that get revealed. 1, 2, 3, and at that point it's starting to get pretty tough to set more tension on that. As you do that, you're going to insert that tension pin. So right now there's no tension on the hinge leaf. If I insert that tension pin and go to the first hole, the locking pin. Now one thing that I don't like about this design, oh no, it's good. Yeah, I was assuming the tension pin was not going to go flush, but it does. I have that installed down to the first hole. Okay, it's got tension set on it. It's ready to go. If you need to alter that, you're going to rotate that slightly counterclockwise, and you're going to attempt to coax that locking pin out. When you have it installed, you're going to want that locking pin flush to the barrel of the hinge. You don't want, we talked earlier about projecting hardware. We sure don't want projecting hardware when it comes to a pin. That can be, and it has been known to be dangerous to people, making unintentional contact with a projecting piece of material that's on there. So be mindful. Sink that all the way in. I did think for a moment that it wouldn't sink. So that's how you set tension. So it's fairly simple and straightforward. We mentioned screws earlier. You will get... See, and that's what's odd about this sort of screw package. There are 2 packages of screws. This client ordered 2 hinges. There are only 4 wood screws, but 8 metal screws. Here's the thinking. It's a 1/4 inch radius. You're not using this on a steel door. You could be using it on a metal clad door where you have a wood edge. But in my opinion, if there was going to be all screws of something, it should certainly be all wood. And then maybe half metal. The point of this is when you're ordering the hinge, absolutely specify what you want. that's very possibly not enough screws to do the installation when you have only half wood screws. If it was a 1250 with a square corner, I would expect all machine screws. So indicate in the comment field what you'd like to be sure to get when the material arrives to you. So looking at the balance of the extended description, the installation instructions, we've exhausted everything that's there. Be mindful that setting tension on spring hinges is likely something that you'll have to do over time. Change it, make changes. As the seasons change, the amount of air pressure that will be stacked in a building will change as well. In the summer, you'll have windows open. You know, there'll be more air flow happening very possibly, whereas in the winter, that's not exactly the case. So you might need to change, you know, the setting on that material. There is a link below this video to the tension screw locking pin package. It's not uncommon for people to remove the tension pin on something and then never, you know, put it back the way it was. So be mindful. You might need to, you know, have that available to you. Okay. Finally, there's a link below this video to the manufacturer's page where you can pull up not only all of the Hager products that we sell, but also a link to the manufacturer's website, as well as a link to the full product catalog. If you have any questions on the Hager, this is their part number 1250, 4.5x4 in a US 26D finish, or any other Hager product, please feel free to reach out to us. And thank you.